They didn't just kill her. They erased her. Her name, her words, her work. But for what? For teaching? For asking questions? For refusing to kneel? Alexandria was once the brightest city in the world, and they dragged its last light through the streets. And when they were done, they burned everything that couldn't bleed. This is not just history. This is a warning. Her name was Hypatia, and what they did to her should haunt every mind that dares to think. The flames were not yet visible, but the smoke, it curled through the alleys of Alexandria like a warning. A city that had once housed the greatest minds on earth now reeked of fear. Mathematicians walked in silence. Scrolls were hidden behind bricks. And in the heart of it all, a woman, Hypatia. Not a sorceress, not a rebel, but a scholar, a seeker of truth, a teacher of the cosmos. She had charted the orbits of stars while others plotted revenge. She had solved equations while men sharpened knives. She had believed in logic, in reason, in dialogue, but the city no longer believed in her. Alexandria had become a powder keg. Roman politics, Christian zealotry, and pagan identity had collided, and when the dust began to settle, someone had to burn. She didn't know they were coming, not at first. She walked the streets like she always had, clothed in white, unarmed, and unafraid. People watched from behind curtains. The cobblestones seemed quieter that day. And then, the crowd. They didn't shout at first. They followed, silent, hateful, men with shaved heads and crosses carved into their wrists. She turned, and that moment, when their eyes met hers, that was the end of the old world, the world where ideas were debated, not destroyed, where a woman could rise by intellect, not be torn apart by ignorance. They dragged her through the streets she once taught in, through the city that once knelt before her mind, and by the time the fire came, it wasn't to illuminate, it was to erase, not just her body, but her legacy, her very existence. Before the knives, before the mob, before the silence, there was a city of thought. Alexandria, not just a name on a map, but a living cathedral of intellect. She stood on the edge of Africa, brushing the Mediterranean like a jewel lodged in the throat of empires. Here, the world didn't just trade goods, it traded ideas. The air was heavy with the scent of ink and papyrus. Scribes hunched over scrolls, preserving the words of Plato, Euclid, Galen. Ships docked not just with grain or gold, but with knowledge. Mathematics from India, star charts from Babylon, philosophy from Athens. And at its center, the library, a wonder of the world, housing hundreds of thousands of texts. More than just a building, it was memory, the collective mind of humanity, bound in scroll and sealed in silence. Walk its halls and you would hear nothing but the whisper of curiosity. There were temples too, columns that reached toward heaven, carved with questions. Streets where debates broke out like music, 100 accents, 1,000 gods. This was the world Hypatia inherited, not built by her hands, but waiting for her mind. It was a city that dared to imagine a universe where logic reigned, where numbers could predict the dance of stars, where no question was too dangerous, so long as it sought truth. Alexandria did not always live up to its promise. There were still slaves, still blood spilled in the name of power. But here, in moments, a woman could rise by the strength of her thought. Here, Hypatia learned to see the stars as more than symbols. Here, she saw the earth as a sphere, not a center. Here, she touched the edge of what was eternal. But under the surface, something festered. The scrolls could not protect against swords. The debates could not drown out the drums of war. And even the heart of Alexandria could rot. Because for all its brilliance, the city had a flaw. It believed it could think its way out of violence. It believed knowledge made it safe. But wisdom, unguarded, is only an invitation to the fire. Before she was legend, she was a daughter. Her name was whispered in Alexandria's lecture halls. But in the privacy of her home, she was simply Hypatia, daughter of Theon. Theon, mathematician, astronomer, keeper of the museum, a man known for charting the stars and raising one. He didn't cradle her in fairy tales. He trained her in geometry. He taught her not how to smile, but how to think. While other girls learned songs, Hypatia studied the music of the spheres. While boys wrestled in sand, she wrestled with logic. He told her, "The mind is the only temple that cannot burn." And she believed him. She wore no veil. She wore no shame. As a child, she walked among scrolls older than empires. She memorized proofs before she knew how to braid her hair. And when she asked why the moon changed shape, Theon didn't say, "Because it's God's will." He said, "Let's find out together." It was an upbringing designed for a son, but fate delivered a daughter, and Theon, to his credit, didn't flinch. He gave her the same tools, the same texts, the same expectations, and she did not disappoint. By 16, she had surpassed him. By 20, she was lecturing Roman officials, not from a scroll, but from memory. She had no degree, no priesthood, no title, but when she spoke, even generals went quiet, because there was fire in her logic, clarity in her chaos. She could explain how planets move and why men fall. She knew the constellations of the heavens and the contradictions of the human heart. But for all her brilliance, she never stopped calling herself what she was, a daughter. She visited her father often, even as fame circled her like a crown. They would sit in candlelight, reading, debating, laughing, as if the world outside wasn't shifting, as if the walls weren't closing in, as if a woman who knew too much wasn't already marked. But in those moments, Hypatia was not the last great philosopher of Alexandria. She was not a pagan icon, not a threat to the church, not a symbol. She was just a girl, raised by a man who believed that thinking was a sacred act. And in teaching her to think, he had unknowingly set her on a path toward destruction, because in Alexandria, the most dangerous thing a woman could carry was an idea. Skeptics became seekers. They said she was a marvel, a spectacle, a woman who walked like a question and spoke like an answer. But Hypatia never sought wonder. She sought truth. And that search, it made her dangerous. She began teaching at the Museum of Alexandria, where only men had once stood. Not from behind a curtain, not from the shadows, but in the open, with chalk on her fingers and thunder in her voice. She lectured on mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, fields reserved for gods and emperors. She used no scripture, no magic, only logic. Her classroom wasn't a place of comfort. It was a crucible. Roman generals came to her with questions. She sent them back with doubts. Priests sat in the back rows, arms crossed. She dismantled their certainties with quiet precision. Even the skeptical leaned forward. She was a Neoplatonist, a believer that reality was shaped not by flesh, but by the purity of thought. That truth wasn't handed down, it was uncovered, step by step, like an equation. She taught that the stars moved with purpose, that the soul, like the sun, rose again, that reason was the highest form of worship. And the students came, dozens at first, then hundreds, drawn not by beauty, though she had that, but by the gravitational pull of her mind. They didn't just listen, they changed. Soldiers became thinkers, pagans, Christians, Jews, they all sat at her feet, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. And in a world where a woman's worth was measured in obedience, Hypatia's defiance was silent and devastating. She never married, not because she couldn't, but because she refused to be possessed. She wore the philosopher's robe, not the bridal veil, carried scrolls instead of children, and when asked why, she answered, "I am wedded to truth." But even as her mind rose like a star, others were preparing to snuff it out. There were whispers in the markets, sermons that turned her name into a curse. Some called her wise, others called her witch. In the minds of the fearful, there was no difference, because what frightened them wasn't her gender, it was her power. The power to move crowds with logic, to question without kneeling, to speak and be heard. She had become more than a philosopher. She was a symbol, and symbols are easy to burn. Alexandria still sparkled on the surface. Temples gleamed, markets buzzed, ships came and went like blood through veins. But beneath the marble, the city trembled. The old gods were fading, the new faith was rising, and in the space between them was war. Rome's grip had loosened, its empire was cracking like old stone, and into the cracks the church poured its fire. Christianity, once hunted, was now the hunter. Crosses replaced statues, altars replaced scrolls, and the men who once hid in catacombs now walked like kings. They said it was divine order, but the city knew better. It was a takeover. Pagan rituals were outlawed, books were burned, statues smashed, and in the forums where thinkers once debated the nature of the soul, now mobs debated who should burn next. It wasn't just a religious shift, it was an identity crisis. Alexandria was a mosaic: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Jewish, Christian, a city of contradictions. And contradiction, left unresolved, becomes chaos. There were riots, murders, scrolls torn in half, families divided by faith. Even the scholars, the last defenders of balance, began to whisper with caution. They knew what was coming. And yet, Hypatia kept teaching. She refused to flee, refused to pick a side. She said, "I follow no creed but reason." But reason had lost its throne. Power now wore robes and carried gospels. The bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, had begun reshaping the city in his image, with sermons that shook columns, with fists hidden beneath holy cloth. To him, tolerance was treason. And Hypatia? She was an infection that needed purging. But she didn't flinch. She still rode through the city in an open chariot, still gave public lectures in the same halls now watched by spies, still met with Roman officials, urging peace. To many, she was a bridge. To others, she was a threat. But one thing was clear. The city was holding its breath, waiting, tensing. Because in Alexandria, You could feel it in the wind, the weight of a coming storm. And at its center stood a woman armed only with thought. They once crept through shadows. They whispered prayers in tombs, drew fish symbols in the sand, and fled when soldiers passed. The early Christians of Alexandria were survivors, martyrs, outcasts. But time has a way of turning victims into rulers. By the 5th century, they no longer ran. They marched, crosses high, chants loud, and beneath the hymns, a hunger for power, for order, for vengeance. It wasn't just faith that surged through the streets. It was frustration. Decades of persecution had forged a fire that no scripture could cool. And leading them was a man who understood both prayer and war. Cyril, the new bishop of Alexandria. A man with sermons sharp as swords. A man who didn't just want to guide the faithful. He wanted to reshape the city in the image of the church. He saw temples as poison, philosophy as seduction, and Hypatia, the brightest mind in the city, as a spark too close to his powder keg. But he was careful. He preached of purity, not violence. But his followers? They heard something else. They saw his frown and swung clubs. He never ordered blood. He simply opened the gates. And through those gates came the Parabolani, once caretakers of the sick, now soldiers in robes. Men who wielded crosses in one hand and stones in the other. They patrolled the streets, watched the temples, whispered names. They didn't need permission, only silence from above. Hypatia saw it happening, saw friends disappear, saw scrolls turn to ash, heard the marketplace grow quieter, not from peace, but fear. Still, she kept speaking, kept reasoning. She believed Alexandria could still choose logic over rage. But rage does not debate, it devours. The Christian surge wasn't a sudden wave. It was a tide that rose inch by inch, until the city woke up underwater. Philosophers fled, temples emptied, and the library, once the pride of the world, stood like a mausoleum to forgotten questions. Cyril's sermons grew louder, his enemies fewer. The city was breaking, not all at once, but like a statue struck in secret places, cracks beneath the marble, tension beneath the chants. And then came the spark. A prefect named Orestes, the Roman governor, tried to balance the storm. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a zealot either. He met with priests, with generals, and with Hypatia. She advised him, not from behind the curtain, but in the open. A philosopher standing beside power. And that was enough to mark her. Because when Orestes and Bishop Cyril clashed, the question wasn't who was right. It was who would bleed first. They fought over laws, over taxes, over souls, and the streets began to echo with anger. Then it happened. A Christian mob ambushed Orestes, stoned him in the street. He barely escaped alive. Cyril claimed innocence, but he did not condemn. Instead, he offered a single name, a scapegoat. Hypatia. She was a pagan, he whispered, a witch, a sorceress who had ensnared Orestes with dark knowledge. The city listened, not because it was true, but because it was easy. They couldn't blame Rome. They couldn't blame God. So they blamed the woman, the one who dared to advise a governor, who walked without fear, who wore white, not black, yet they still saw a shadow. Rumors spread like wildfire through the streets, that she cursed the bishop, that she read stars to control men, that her scrolls were spells. There were no trials, no questions, just whispers, and then footsteps. The Parapolani began watching her chariot more closely. The sermons sharpened, the silence deepened. And Hypatia? She did not hide. She still lectured, still rode, still believed that knowledge would save the city. But Alexandria had made its choice. Not for reason, not for balance, but for blame. And in that moment, she became more than a philosopher. She became an offering. Because in every collapsing empire, there must always be someone to burn. They were meant to serve. That was how it began. The Parabolani were Christian volunteers, caregifters of the dying, lifters of the lepers, saints in the shadows. They were the men who stepped into plague houses when others ran, men who touched the untouchable, who buried the unclaimed dead. But time bends all things, even mercy. And as the church grew in power, so too did its fists. The Parabolani no longer carried stretchers. They carried clubs. They still wore robes, but under them, armor. Still whispered psalms, but with blood on their breath. They became enforcers, fanatics forged in scripture and sharpened by sermons. Not an army in name, but in function. They were everywhere and nowhere, moving through crowds, eyes lowered, waiting for a nod from the pulpit. They called themselves defenders of the faith, but the scrolls they once guarded now burned at their feet, and the sick they once tended were forgotten, as the sickness of doubt became the new plague. Hypatia saw them watching her, silent figures near the agora, men who once asked questions, now clutching rocks. They didn't argue, they glared. To them, she was not a woman, not a scholar. She was a threat wrapped in flesh, because she spoke of stars, not saints, because she bowed to no bishop, because she stood beside Orestes, a Roman, instead of kneeling before the church. To the Parabolani, truth was not discovered, it was dictated, and anything that didn't come from scripture smelled of sin. Their numbers grew, their patience shrank. Cyril denied nothing, endorsed nothing, but his silence was a drumbeat, and they marched to it. Soon, Alexandria pulsed with tension. Markets cleared when they passed. Mothers clutched children tighter, and the few remaining scholars whispered plans to flee. But Hypatia stayed, even as her students warned her, even as friends vanished, even as the Parabolani closed in like wolves, disguised as lambs. They did not strike that day, nor the next, but they circled, closer, hungrier. They were no longer the men who cleaned wounds. They were the wound, and the city let them fester. She stepped out like she always did, head high, chariot waiting. The morning sun catching the white of her robe. There was no fear in her posture, no hesitation in her stride. But Alexandria had changed. The streets were quieter, shutters half closed. Vendors watched but didn't wave. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She always noticed patterns, details, silences between the notes. And today, the silence was louder than usual. The Parabolani had gathered near the temple steps, not in chaos, in calm. That was the danger. They didn't shout, didn't chase. They followed. At first it seemed like curiosity. Then, intention. She turned a corner, and they turned with her. Another block, still behind. She gripped the reins, her heartbeat steady, but the city felt smaller that day, its alleys tighter, its walls closer. She had walked these roads for years, taught students in these forums, debated truths in these very courtyards. And yet now, she felt like a trespasser in her own city. A fruit seller looked away. A guard disappeared around a column. Even the horses grew restless. Then the sound. Footsteps. Too many. Too close. She stopped the chariot, turned. They were there. Not dozens, hundreds. Robes rustling, eyes burning, hands empty, but not for long. She didn't scream, didn't beg. She stepped down, dignified, deliberate. And for a moment, just a flicker, the crowd paused. Because there she was, Hypatia, unarmed, unyielding, everything they feared, everything they once admired. One of them shouted, a name, a curse, and the moment broke. They surged, hands grasped, fists swung, the robe tore, the woman vanished beneath them. Her thoughts, soaring, infinite, star-bound, were now drowned beneath flesh and fury. They dragged her from the chariot, down the marble steps, across the cobblestones, the teacher of emperors, the voice of Alexandria, now hauled like an animal by men who could not understand what she was. The streets bore witness, but they did not intervene, because by now, everyone knew this was the end of something, not just a life, but an era. The last great mind of the ancient world, taking her final ride through a city no longer worthy of her. They didn't take her to a prison, or a court, or a palace. They took her to a temple. Not a place of worship, a ruin, a shattered shell of what once was sacred. The Caesareum, once a temple of emperors, now a battleground of gods, its statues broken, its columns scorched, its silence louder than thunder. And within its walls, they began. The Parabolani dragged her across the blood-stained stones, her white robe torn, her skin scraped raw, but her eyes still open. They spat scriptures as they circled her, not prayers, curses. They called her witch, heretic, daughter of demons, but what they feared wasn't her sorcery. It was her mind. She had questioned too much, spoken too clearly, shone too brightly, and now they would erase all of it. They stripped her not just of cloth, but of dignity, of defiance. Stones were the first to strike, then tiles from the broken floor, shards of the very city she had tried to uplift. They didn't kill her quickly. That would have been mercy. They tore her apart, bit by bit, word by word, until the philosopher was no longer recognizable as human. And when her voice was gone, when her breath was only silence, they gathered the pieces, what remained of her body, and burned them. Not to honor her, not to mourn her, but to obliterate her, to scatter her memory like ash on the wind, to ensure that no shrine could rise in her name, no statue, no scroll. They wanted the world to forget, but the world, the real world, remembers, because even in that temple of bones, Surrounded by madness and fire, something survived. An idea, a defiance, a question, too powerful to die. What if truth matters more than power? And what if just for a moment, a woman embodied that truth? There was no funeral, no procession, no candlelit vigil, just smoke and silence. Hypatia's body, once revered by philosophers and feared by kings, was reduced to ash, thrown into the wind like waste. The Parabolani didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. They had done what they came to do. The bishop said nothing. The church moved on. And Alexandria, it simply exhaled. People returned to the markets. The guards returned to their posts. The scholars, what few remained, packed their scrolls and slipped into exile. A quiet fell over the city, not the peace of harmony, but the hush of trauma. Because everyone knew something sacred had been broken. Not just a life, but a lineage. A bridge between worlds, between Plato and Newton, between the stars and the soul. Hypatia had carried centuries of wisdom, not in her hands, but in her mind. She was the last flame in a library of thought, now drowned in holy water and blood. The Library of Alexandria, once a beacon to the world, now stood as a relic, dusty, desolate, guarded not by scholars, but by suspicion. And her students? They vanished, some into hiding, some into madness, some into silence that would last generations. Because when a mind like Hypatia's is murdered, it sends a message. Thinking is dangerous. And for centuries, that message echoed louder than any prayer. But not forever, because the wind that scattered her ashes carried something else, a whisper, a question, a defiance. That maybe, just maybe, ideas are stronger than the hands that try to crush them. Today, we know her name, Hypatia. We speak it with reverence, with sorrow, with rage, not because they succeeded in erasing her, but because they failed. And in that failure, they revealed everything. That ignorance fears knowledge, that power fears truth, and that even in ashes, a voice can rise. A voice that still asks us, even now, what will you do with your mind? He never touched the stones, never raised his hand, never shouted in the streets. But Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, didn't have to. His words did the work. He preached of purity, of divine order, of the danger of false idols. He never named Hypa directly, not in public, but his followers knew. The silences between his sentences were instructions, and the blood that followed, that was obedience. After her death, Cyril did not mourn. He did not condemn. He ascended, praised by church councils, granted sainthood in time, remembered not as a zealot, but as a shepherd of souls. History, written by the survivors, painted him in gold leaf, but behind the mitre and incense lay a truth as heavy as the tombs he helped fill. The death of Hypatia was not an accident, and the books? Ah, the books, the scrolls, the codices, the shelves upon shelves of parchment that once housed the memory of mankind. They began to vanish, not in one grand bonfire, but in 1,000 small disappearances. A scroll refused at the academy, a volume deemed heretical, a scholar driven into exile for quoting the wrong stars. The flame of inquiry dimmed, replaced by dogma, and in the quiet halls of what remained of the great library, dust settled on knowledge. Cyril didn't burn the books himself, but he ensured fewer hands reached for them. He built churches on top of temples, raised bishops where philosophers once stood, replaced debate with decree. To the devout, he was a builder, to the fearful, a savior, but to the future, a shadow, because what he buried wasn't just a woman, a way of thinking, a belief that truth was discovered, not dictated, that wisdom could come from anywhere, even a woman with chalk-stained fingers and questions too big for one God. And yet, books are strange things. They hide, they survive, they wait. Centuries later, they would speak again. And when they did, Hypatia's name returned, not as a blasphemy, but as a beacon, proof that even under the weight of mitres and martyrdom, ideas endure. And the bishop, he got his sainthood, but she got eternity. You cannot measure what was lost, not in scrolls, not in dates, not even in names, because what Hypatia carried was not just knowledge, it was momentum, a trajectory from the stars to the soul, from Pythagoras to Copernicus, from wonder to understanding. She didn't just solve problems, she framed the questions others were too afraid to ask. What if the earth moved? What if the planets danced to math instead of myth? What if truth didn't need a god to validate it? She dared to map the heavens, while others mapped borders. She sought harmony in chaos, while others declared war on doubt. And when she was murdered, the world didn't just lose a philosopher, it lost a future. What discoveries died with her? What students never learned because fear silenced their teacher? What inventions never bloomed because minds were taught to kneel before they could question? The West fell into centuries of silence, a darkness misnamed holy, where science became suspicion, and reason was chained to altars. It would take over 1,000 years for the world to remember what it once knew. That thought is not treason. That women can be vessels of truth. That questions are sacred. When Hypatia died, she became more than a martyr. She became a symbol of brilliance punished, of courage unrewarded, of a world that chose ignorance because it was easier than change. And yet, even in loss, she endured. In whispers, in myths, in the quiet reverence of thinkers who came later and saw in her not just a victim, but a warning. That ideas must be protected, even when they are inconvenient, especially when they are dangerous. What was lost with Hypatia was not just a person, it was a direction, a road untraveled, a light extinguished, so that empires could sleep comfortably in the dark. They thought her death would be the end, that silence would swallow her name, that time would dust over her story, until she became no more than a footnote, if that. But time remembers differently, because true voices don't vanish. They echo, in the scratch of a quill centuries later, in the cautious whisper of a girl reading forbidden texts, in the fire behind a question asked when no one wants it asked. Hypatia's voice never stopped. It found its way into the libraries of the Renaissance, the manifestos of rebels, the daydreams of daughters told to stay quiet. Generations who never knew her face still felt her spirit when they touched a telescope, or cracked an equation, or refused to kneel before unearned authority. Her name passed through dark halls where thinkers were jailed, through battlefields where minds were treated like weapons, through centuries where men claimed reason but refused its consequences. And every time someone said, "What if?" she was there. Her murder didn't erase her. It multiplied her, because martyrs are not silenced. They are amplified. Every time a regime burned books, her ghost flinched but stood taller. Every time a woman was told her place wasn't at the front of a classroom, Hypatia stepped into the room anyway. Every time faith tried to choke fact, she became the breath between them. The world changed, empires fell, gods crumbled, and still she endured. Not because she fought wars, but because she fought for thought, and that outlives kings. Even now, her name flickers in classrooms, on monuments, in stories like this one, not as a victim, but as a challenge. Will we forget again? Will we let fear wear the mask of faith? Will we stand silent when the next thinker is dragged to the altar? Or will we listen to the echo, the one that started in Alexandria, with a woman, a scroll, and the courage to think out loud? For centuries, her name was spoken in shadows, not on altars, not in cathedrals, but in whispers, among philosophers, skeptics, dreamers. Hypatia, a name outlawed by power, but kept alive by those who understood what had truly been lost. You wouldn't find her in stained glass or gilded pages of holy books, but she lived on, in the quiet defiance of a student who asked why, in the ink of a scientist refusing to bow to doctrine, in the soul of a woman who chose thought over obedience. Europe forgot her, for a time. The church buried her memory under sainthood in silence. But memory is a patient thing, and when the world began to wake again, during the Renaissance, during the Enlightenment, her name rose with it. Historians dusted off fragments, letters, mentions in obscure chronicles. Artists painted her as muse, writers crowned her as martyr, feminists hailed her as a pioneer. Even scientists, centuries removed, spoke of her with awe, because what she represented wasn't just a lost mind. She was a mirror, reflecting everything civilization could have been if it hadn't flinched from its own potential. She became a symbol of the mind unchained, of woman unbound, of ideas that do not need temples to be sacred. Streets were named after her, universities honored her, statues were raised, not to worship, but to remember. And still, her name carries power, not because she conquered armies, but because she resisted erasure, because she dared to live a life built on truth in a world that preferred lies wrapped in incense. Every time someone discovers her story, it feels like a secret rediscovered, a treasure smuggled through history. Hypatia, they tried to reduce her to ash, but they failed, because her name was not written in stone, it was etched in thought, and thought, once awakened, cannot be killed. It wasn't magic they feared, or rebellion, or some pagan curse whispered in the alleys of Alexandria. What they feared was her mind, a mind that refused to bend, that wouldn't cower before scripture, that questioned when others were told to accept. Hypatia didn't burn temples, she dismantled illusions, with logic, with numbers, with ideas that slipped past swords and went straight to the bone. She charted the stars, not to worship them, but to understand them. She wrote proofs that unwrapped the universe, explained motion, shape, gravity, before gravity had a name. And in doing so, she exposed the fragile foundation of the world around her. Because what happens when a woman knows more than a priest, when she draws truth from the sky while they draw power from fear? They couldn't answer her questions, so they answered with violence. They couldn't match her intellect, so they smeared her with rumors, whispered that she bewitched men, that her beauty confused the faithful, that her teachings were poison wrapped in parchment. But none of it was true. The real poison was fear. The fear that if people listened to her, they might stop listening to them. The church, the mob, the empire. They needed certainty. She offered complexity. They needed obedience. She taught inquiry. They needed darkness. She lit the sky. And that is why she had to die. Not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. The terrifying possibility that knowledge could belong to anyone, that a woman could rise without permission, that truth could stand without a pulpit beneath it. Her death was not justice, it was cowardice, the final act of men who looked at brilliance and chose to snuff it out rather than rise to meet it. But here's the thing about light. You can kill the torchbearer, but not the flame. She wasn't just a philosopher, she was the last. the final light of a lineage stretching from Plato to Plotinus, from Socrates' questions in the square to Euclid's lines on parchment, a golden chain of thought that spanned centuries, snapped, not in debate, but in blood. With Hypatia's death, the doors of the ancient world groaned shut. The academies emptied, the scrolls were shelved or burned, and the tools of reason were buried beneath sermons. What followed was not pause, it was pause. A pause on curiosity, on innovation, on progress. For centuries. She was not replaced. No school rose in her name. No disciple carried her torch into the open, because there were none left bold enough to try. The thinkers that came after whispered in back rooms. They copied texts in secret. They hid diagrams inside prayers. It would be 1,000 years before the world was ready to ask questions again. And in that silence, a darkness spread, not of war, but of unknowing. The planets moved still, but no one tracked them. The body ached, but no one dissected it. The numbers called, but no one listened, because the last philosopher had fallen, and with her, the belief that truth was a right, not a sin. To understand what was lost, you must imagine a world where the stars go dim, not because they vanish, but because no one dares look up. That's what her death meant. Not just the end of a life, but the interruption of civilization. And yet, even the longest night ends. When dawn came, when the Renaissance cracked open the tomb, her name was there, whispered, half remembered, but waiting for a world brave enough to think again. They killed the woman, but they created the myth. Not a myth of miracles, not of sainthood or prophecy, but of something even more dangerous to tyrants, a woman who thought freely. In their attempt to erase her, they gave her power they never imagined, because myths are not bound by flesh. They move through time, through ink, through art and memory and revolt, and Hypatia became more than herself. She became every woman silenced in a room of men, every mind punished for daring to ask why, every soul burned at the stake of dogma and fear. She became symbol and sword, a question etched into history's conscience. Why are the brightest so often destroyed by the blind? She was reborn in literature, in poems and novels and films, each one painting her not just as victim, but as resistance. She stood beside Galileo in the prison of ideas, walked with Joan of Arc toward the flame, echoed in the footsteps of every dissenter who chose truth over comfort. And still, her myth unsettles, because it tells a truth no empire once remembered, that power built on ignorance is brittle, that burning a body doesn't kill a mind, that ideas, once unleashed, do not return to silence. They feared her teachings, but what they feared more was that people would follow them, that they would stop kneeling, start questioning, and realize that even sacred robes can hide trembling hands. They turned her into a warning. Don't be like her, they said. Stay silent, stay small. But the myth rewrote the message. Now it whispers, be exactly like her, speak anyway, because the greatest threat to tyranny is not rebellion, it's thought. And she, more than anyone, proved that a mind awakened is a revolution in motion. A body can be broken, a voice can be silenced, but a legacy, that's something else. They tore her from the world, but they couldn't uproot what she had planted, because Hypatia's legacy wasn't just knowledge, it was permission. Permission to think, to question, to believe that truth doesn't need robes to be holy, or swords to be respected. She didn't found an empire. She didn't write a gospel. She didn't claim divine revelation. And yet, she changed the course of civilization. Every woman who picks up a pen, every student who challenges the textbook, every scientist who draws a line between the stars and says, "There must be more," they are her children. She taught the cosmos without claiming it. She explored without conquering. She loved knowledge not for what it could earn, but for what it could liberate. And that survives. Even when her city crumbled, even when her scrolls turned to ash, even when her name was buried beneath centuries of male dominance, she endured, in the quiet courage of those who kept asking, in the brilliance of minds told they didn't belong, in the fire of thinkers who refused to dim their light. Her legacy is in every whisper that became a roar, every doubt that became a breakthrough, every question that led to the stars. They couldn't kill that, because legacy isn't built in temples, it's built in impact, and hers reached farther than they ever feared, far enough to reach you, right now, listening, wondering, remembering. That once, in Alexandria, there was a woman who lived without fear and died for it. But her legacy? It lived, it lives, and as long as thought survives, so will she. Thought does not stay buried forever. It can be silenced, smothered beneath dogma, buried under fear and fire and ash, but only for a while, because thought is patient, and eventually it returns. Centuries after Hypatia's screams faded from Alexandria's streets, the world stirred. The scrolls she once studied were dust, her writings mostly gone, but her spirit, that spark, it had traveled, carried in secret by monks who copied forbidden texts, by women who taught in kitchens instead of classrooms, by rebels who saw the stars not as gods, but as questions waiting to be answered. And then, the Renaissance. Like breath after drowning, Europe opened its eyes and remembered it had once thought, once asked, once calculated, once dared. They looked back, and there she was, not just Hypatia the martyr, but Hypatia the mind. Her name resurfaced in treatises, in letters, in debates about reason and belief. Philosophers invoked her, astronomers nodded toward her courage, writers imagined her story with awe and grief. She became a symbol, not of the past, but of the possible, proof that the pursuit of truth was older than cathedrals and stronger than censorship. Her death was no longer a tragedy alone. It was a beginning, because from the ruins of her world, a new world would rise, a world that questioned again, that studied again, that dared to trace the stars and say, "We were wrong before, but we can learn again." Hypatia's rebirth wasn't in flesh, it was in thought. When that thought awakened, when minds remembered how to move, the fire they lit would sweep the world. From telescopes to test tubes, from rights to revolutions, from ink to binary code, her spirit was in all of it, not as a ghost, but as an ancestor, the first voice in a long chorus of thinkers who refused to be told that silence was holy. Her rebirth was ours, and it still is. The streets where she died are quiet now. No blood, no fire, no mobs chanting with blind fury, just sunlight spilling over ruins and echoes. Alexandria has changed, the world has changed, and yet her shadow still walks these stones, because from her ashes we have drawn light, not just mourning, but meaning, not just loss, but legacy. Every mind that dares today walks a path cleared by her suffering. Every idea that survives suppression, every truth spoken in dangerous places, is proof that the fire meant to erase her only revealed her brilliance more clearly. The flames that licked her skin have become the torch we pass from generation to generation. They tried to destroy her wisdom with clubs, but wisdom doesn't bruise, it burns brighter. They thought history would forget her, but we built her a throne of memory. Not in marble, but in every classroom, every observatory, every library where thought is still free. Her name lives in the satellites that orbit the planets she once mapped, in the voices of girls who choose science over silence, in the men who listen and learn. From ashes, light. This is the truth they feared, that the mind once sparked spreads like wildfire, that a single life, lived bravely, can ignite centuries, that even if they burn your body, if your words reach one other soul, you live. And she has, not as a relic, but as a revolution. She did not die in vain, she lit the way, and now it's ours to carry forward. Close your eyes. Forget the year. Forget the robes and scrolls and oil lamps. Forget the marble halls of Alexandria. Imagine her here, now, walking into a university lecture hall, or a tech lab, or a room full of politicians and priests and pundits. Would they welcome her, or would they still flinch? Would we offer her a microphone, or another mob? Because Hypatia never belonged to the 4th century, she belonged to every century that dared to think. And if she returned today, in jeans and sneakers with data on her screen instead of ink on parchment, she would still terrify the gatekeepers of comfort and control. Because she'd ask the same questions. Why are lies so loud and truth so fragile? Why do the powerful always wrap their fear in righteousness? Why does a woman still have to bleed to be heard? She would walk through our headlines and see the same fires, books banned, science denied, women silenced, and she'd say, have we really changed, or just rebranded our ignorance? But she'd also see something else. She'd see girls coding constellations, boys questioning borders, teachers defying silence in classrooms filled with truth. She'd see people, like you, listening, and she'd know. The fight wasn't wasted. The pain wasn't pointless. The questions still matter. She wouldn't need a temple. She'd open a browser. She wouldn't seek an altar. She'd spark a forum. She wouldn't die in the streets. She'd go viral. But the danger? It would still be there. Because a mind like hers will always be a threat to those who profit from obedience. So maybe the question isn't, what if Hypatia returned? Maybe the real question is, would we protect her this time? Or would we scroll past as the flames rose again? Because she is here, in every brave voice, in every truth that won't stay buried, in every girl who won't shrink to fit the world's comfort. The philosopher never left. She became us. So when you speak up, when you choose knowledge over noise, when you challenge what's easy to defend, what's right, that's her. That's the return. And the next time the mob comes, the next time the world flinches from a mind too bright, let it find not one woman alone, but millions behind her. Let them see, the philosopher has returned. And this time, she's not burning, she's building.